something inside me's change.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jordan Chitley. I'm the editor of Globe Drive, the car section here at the Globe and Mail. And I'd like to welcome everyone in the room today and everyone who's watching across Canada on our live webcast. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto's home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful for the opportunity to gather and learn here today. Over the course of the next couple hours, we'll talk about the future of the automotive industry for automakers and for consumers. I think you'll agree the market for new and used vehicles is a challenging one these days due to issues such as supply, inflation, and high interest rates. At the same time, we're seeing a massive shift to cleaner powertrains such as electric, hydrogen, and hybrid. So definitely a lot to talk about today. And some housekeeping notes. If you're joining us today in person, there will be opportunity for networking at the break after the second session and also after all the sessions have concluded today. Also, washrooms are located just out in the hallway here. The exit to use will be the one at the back. We ask that you not use this exit because of the webcast. And anyone who is on the webcast, please feel free to send in questions as the panels are going on, and we will try to answer them toward the end of the panel. We asked also that everyone put their phones on silent if you are in the room. And also, if you would like to ask a question and you are in the room, because of the webcast, we ask that you wait till the microphone gets to you before you actually ask the question, so everyone who is watching remotely will be able to hear it. All right. We're going to get started with our first panel. I'm pleased to introduce you to Patrina Gentili, an automotive journalist and frequent contributor to Globe Drive, and she will be moderating our first panel.
Thanks, Jordan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our first panel discussion on e-vehicle demand. How is Canada trending? As Jordan mentioned, my name is Patrina, and I've been writing for the Drive section of the Globe and Mail for 20 years now. And I also report on the automotive beat for a number of TV stations like CTV and BNN Bloomberg and CP24. And over the course of 20 years, I've driven a lot of amazing vehicles, everything from a $2.2 million Pagani Huayra to the Lamborghini Revolto, their first plug-in hybrid on a racetrack north of Rome, to the GMC Hummer EV truck off-roading in Arizona. I've been reporting more on electric vehicles, and we know that we're seeing a lot more of these vehicles coming to market. About 40 will be coming this year. So what is the demand for these electric vehicles? To talk about that, we're joined by our esteemed panelists, starting with Stephen Beattie. He's the Vice President Corporate at Toyota Canada, if you want to have a seat up. And Dan Guato, he is the Director for Business Consulting and Energy Transition at EY Canada. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I do want to mention we'll have about 5 minutes at the end of the discussion for your questions. But first, I want to really jump into this discussion because I know that time is going to go fast. I want to start with Dan, first of all. What's the current take rate on EVs in Canada, and can you break it down between pure battery electric vehicles and hybrids?
Well, across Canada, it's about 13%, a little over 13%. I think BC is the highest at about 26%. In every province and the Yukon, it went up in the third quarter of last year. Nunavut and Northwest Territories went down. But there's a general trend upward across Canada.
And are you seeing that demand like in all provinces across Canada?
All provinces and the Yukon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stephen, how is that rate compared to, when you look at your whole portfolio? Because you really have everything in your portfolio. You have electrified vehicles, hydrogen, pure electric vehicles, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and ICE. How is demand pacing for those electric vehicles versus traditional ICE vehicles?
So ICE as a percentage of our portfolio is dropping all the time. But I would say we're different from a lot of other car companies because we're sort of heavily invested in switching our conventional ICE powertrain over to hybrids. Meanwhile, at the other end of this, I guess last year, out of about 230,000 vehicles sold, close to 100,000 of them were electrified in some form, whether it was hybrid, plug-in hybrid, battery electric, or fuel cell electric. And about 16,000 of the vehicles we sold were plug-ins out of that 100,000. So it gives you sort of a sense that there's increasing growth in that part of the marketplace. But when you start to look at the drivers, a lot of it comes down to the amount of incentives available to consumers from government grants. It also comes down to ZEV mandates and how they cut across the country. So you're seeing very, very different rates of adoption. And certainly, as Dan said, BC is leading the way. Quebec, hot on their heels, and then other parts of the country, you're at an earlier adoption stage on the curve. The real issue for me is when you look around the major metropolitan areas like Vancouver and Montreal, in the Goldilocks zone, that space where you can park in your own driveway and charge, we're getting very, very high rates of penetration. As you start to move in either direction from that space, then things start to fall off. And getting out to the country is probably not a problem. You have to have the right vehicles, but the downtown core of cities remains a real challenge.
Well, there are other challenges. I mean, it's the infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure. We've saw cold temperatures. We saw a lot of reports this winter, in Chicago and Toronto, people couldn't charge their vehicles because of these cold temperatures. And in Alberta, where temperatures were minus 40, you weren't advised to cut back your electricity. So there's still some challenges. I mean, Dan, do you want to start first with weighing in on what your research is showing about what is still holding people back in terms of jumping on that EV bandwagon?
Yeah, there's a lot of media that talks about things like the cold weather, and we've heard many times the grid's not going to be ready, and those things really aren't well understood or aren't well explained. Like, for example, the cold weather issue is really a generation capacity issue, not a power availability. It's just the generation side rather than the vehicles. The grid, we're moving from an era where we designed the grid to meet the peak demand, 100 plus years of that behavior, to an era where we have technologies that can help us manage energy at the edge of the grid now. And you have to look at EVs in the context of the greater distributed resources like stationary storage and solar and EVs combined, and what that means to the operability of the grid, so that we're not just simply building bigger infrastructure to supply yet another higher peak all at the same time, simultaneously with the peak that's already there. So it's opening up this era of the utilities' ability to actually control a local energy market, and to also provide consumer benefits for doing so in terms of pricing, for example. The average Canadian drives 50 kilometers or less per day, 2,000 kilowatt hours per year. It's about 5.5 kilowatt hours per day. If you look at the ultra-low overnight price, that's 15 cents for a day's worth of driving. You can't make that work in terms of gasoline dollars. It's much higher than that. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying there's the price difference. But people are thinking, oh, my electricity bill is going to go up dramatically. But that's the reality of it. And even if you go to the highest price, the high peak price, it's still $1.57 or something like that for that day's worth of driving. And so those are the kinds of things. When we look at people who don't own EVs, about 43% of them say they'll consider an EV for the next car purchase. With a little bit of education, that jumps up to about 63%. And it's things like that they just don't realize when they're considering it.
So I would just say that Dan makes a fair point, which is that for the people who are able to plug in at home and charge overnight, incredible competitive advantage for EVs. The problem is not enough Canadians have the opportunity to be able to plug in at home. And, so here we are in downtown Toronto with condos all around us. We need to be able to give everybody that right to plug in and to be able to benefit from it. And to think about what that means, we recently ran a a series of vehicles up into northern Ontario just to look at what the state of the DC fast charging network was like. What was the takeaway from all of this was, of course, we were having to charge during peak hours during the day. There are, of course, the additional charging times required versus filling gas, but we tried to level that out. But what was interesting was that the charge for the cost, if you will, for charging through the DC fast charger network, at least on the routes that we were on, was equivalent to what it would have cost us to fuel up our least fuel efficient SUV, and that's a problem. All right, so we need to find a way to give people better access to affordable charging, and that's what will make the difference. But as I said, right now, I can sell vehicles to people living in downtown Toronto. It's just a real challenge to get an EV into their hands if they don't have a dedicated driveway.
And it's not just that, it's also the affordability of these electric vehicles. The average price of an EV in Canada is $77,000, but when you look at everything has gone up. I realize that the average price of a new car is $6,000. So are we ever going to see affordable vehicles in the electric market space, or are we going to have to wait for those Chinese automakers to come in and give us some of those options? Stephen?
Well, I guess the question is, are you going to see affordable vehicles generally? It's one of those strange scenarios that in fact, environmental standards in Canada led us to build bigger and bigger cars because we moved from a fuel economy standard to a greenhouse gas standard where it was based on the footprint of the vehicle. So one of the ways to gain efficiency is to actually increase the size of the vehicle. That's easier to do than to make a small, already fuel-efficient vehicle more efficient. So if you walk outside of here and look around, you're not going to see very many small cars anymore. You're seeing people driving around downtown Toronto in SUVs and pickup trucks. And as that's happened, the average price of vehicles has gone up. I think you need a bit of a rethink around how the rules are applied in order to get us back to a world where we're looking at smaller, more energy efficient vehicles. We're going to need them. And those issues around grid capacity and so forth, we can't be driving pickup trucks as commuter cars.
On that question, the average price in Canada is $67,800, I believe, and there's 47 models now below that average price that are plug-in hybrids or pure electrics that are available. And for all the people that are buying above the average prices, there's also lots of models above that price. So with 200 some models still to come to the market, I think there's going to be lots of choice eventually, but we're still relatively early in that. But 47 is still a pretty big number below the average price, and gives people a significant amount of choice already.
And Stephen, why has gasoline hung on so long?
Well, I guess a couple of reasons. One, it's we went through this very same competition at the start of the auto industry, where we had steam-driven cars, battery-driven cars, and others. But the benefit of gasoline, and remember there was no infrastructure at the time, is that it was relatively inexpensive, but it was also high in energy density. Yeah. So from the standpoint of being able to actually drive long distances at a relatively low cost, gasoline for a long time had an advantage. Now, that's changed, and certainly adding carbon taxes and doing all of the other adjustments that are going on, changed that balance. But here's the difference. If we're talking about all-in cost, and this is what we have to struggle with as people looking to put vehicles in front of the public, I can adjust the amount that I drive. In other words, if gas prices go up, I can decide that I'm going to back off on some of the trips that I make. What I can't do is back off on a monthly payment that I've entered into on a new vehicle. Fortunately, it looks like interest rates are coming back down. Knock on wood. But that's been a real issue over the last couple of years. It's affected people's choice in the market.
One of the things that I was going to mention on that, and it goes back to a point that you made about public charging. Public charging also is a method that people think about before they get an EV. 2/3 to 3/4 of all their charging will be done at home, and even in a multi-unit residential. But there are some situations that are difficult, like houses with no driveways or no garages. But let's assume that 3/4, because that's been the data so far. 2/3 to 3/4 of charging occurs at home. So a lot of drivers will never even seek to use public charging except just as a convenience when they're out, unless they're on a long drive. And when people are on a long drive, you stop for coffee or you stop to use the washroom or whatever other reason you stop, people are saying you can't do those things quickly enough. It's already picked up the number of kilometers you need to get to the next charger, and it's not as inconvenient as people think because you wait in those lines for coffee or whatever you're doing. And so people learn that the vehicle's different. Just like they don't go to a phone booth with their mobile phone to make a call. They've learned different patterns once they get the vehicle, right? And it's because they don't understand that ahead of time, and because, as Stephen mentioned, the public charging network has not been the most reliable for people that have accessed it. There's too many apps. Charging operators have throttled their units down to try to make the business case better. They don't want to pay the peak demand charge, so they don't get the rate of charge that they expect when they get there. Or sometimes they're just not working at all. And so, there are efforts right now that we're involved with at EY that are trying to address some of those things and say, here's how it should be. It shouldn't be in the back alley behind the hotel. It should be as accessible and as well lit and as convenient as possible, just like liquid refueling has been. And so those are the things that people see in the media or hear from their friends that make them think twice about making the move at that point in time.
It can be very frustrating. At least I find when I'm driving an electric vehicle, and you do have to stop, and you're right, they're not in always safe
Yes.
spots, and they're not well lit, they're often not working, or a gas vehicle is parked in front of it, or it's a slow charger where it's like, oh, you need 6 hours to charge. It's not like a Tesla. When I drive a Tesla and I go over to the supercharging network, I'm like, wow, this is incredible. There are like 15 that are open. I just have to pull up. I don't need an app. I suppose, though, having many manufacturers latch on to that Tesla supercharging network, will that help bring more consumers to EVs?
I would just say that, it's great. The reason that you're not lined up right now is it's an exclusive network. If we have everybody moving to the Tesla network, then they're going to have to be able to, really move their construction rate ahead. And we were talking about this over lunch, but one of the issues that we're facing in North America is this, sort of direction of public policy around EVs and the desire to drive China out of the supply chain. Well, if you do that, the problem with it is so many of the components that go into not just the vehicles but the charging infrastructure come from China. If the U.S. heads down that path as radically as they seem to want to go, it's going to be very difficult to meet the requirements at the rate that I think the marketplace would be prepared to accept in terms of adoption of electric technology.
Do you agree with that, Dan?
Yeah, it's a target. They have to start with something. Is it achievable? I guess we'll find out. But I think they mean well in attempting to lower the carbon footprint, giving people the ability to do that by having the manufacturers comply with things like the ZEV mandates. Because those things evidently are working in provinces like BC where the uptake is much higher. And in Ontario, and we've got some experience, nothing against my colleague here, but some of the other OEMs have said, we'll meet the market. And then they just have not delivered to the rate that they have in Quebec or in BC. And so I think the government's trying to incent that a little bit. And, again, is it the right target? We'll find out.
Well, okay, so to that point.
I'm waiting for this. This is my favorite part.
Yeah, the ZEV mandates in BC and Quebec have bluntly been a disaster. And the reason they've been a disaster is they turned the value of technology upside down. And the problem with that is not that it isn't achieving what Quebec and BC want, which is to get a disproportionate share of the electric vehicles into their market.
Yeah.
What it's doing, though, is it's taking vehicles away from the rest of the country where people who might pay a market rate with their own dollars are prepared to buy those vehicles, but they're just not available to them.
Yeah.
And my concern with it basically is over time, there is no government in the country that is going to be able to afford the types of incentives that are in place. So what we've seen, and we saw it here in Ontario as example, is that when incentives go away, then the market starts to stall. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because if we hit the federal 60% target by 2030, we're talking about billions of dollars in a single year in incentives, and that's not affordable to Canadians.
Well, I totally agree with you. I think we need to move away from incentives, get past the point where incentives are necessary, and I think it has to become a discussion around the economics of owning an EV versus owning a gasoline car. They're better economics. People are going to start to see that as more models become available and the price points are achievable for them. I mean, they're buying cars at the average price anyway, so if they can find a vehicle that fits their needs, and I always say this to people, don't just sell a car early to get an EV. Find a vehicle that fits your needs just like you would regularly, and make sure it's economical, it carries the load you want, it has the range you need. I'm aware of people that deliberately chose short-range Teslas. They didn't want to carry the battery around everywhere they went, they didn't want to pay for the extra battery, and they fit it to their needs. And so that's the kind of thinking that I think will go into purchases, and of course, they were well aware of the cost savings that they'd experienced. So I think, yes, we should be moving away from incentives. We can't keep incentives going indefinitely. I think they're needed, at least initially, to encourage new technologies, but there's going to come a point when we don't need them any longer.
Last word to you, Stephen.
Well, I would just say I am the most unpopular person in the auto industry because I don't believe in incentives. I think we use incentives on a daily basis to manage our fleets. And so we know what happens. Once you've put $1 on in the front end, then it comes off the back end, and you start into a spiral, and it becomes very difficult to ever right the marketplace after you've done that. But that having been said, we're down that path now, and what the soft landing is for that is going to be really important. Again, because we are racing toward targets at 2030 and 35. It's going to be really important to manage that transition correctly. And just to think about it, I mean, we're watching right now with the existing number of models in the market, there's inventory on dealer lots across the country. The next 40 vehicles that get added, there'll be more inventory on dealer lots. Invariably, what happens when you get a backup of inventory is pricing does come down, but then people start to exit. And it's been interesting, for example, to watch the number of announcements over the last few months as people have been sort of backpedaling and saying, all right, well, maybe plug-in hybrids, weren't such a bad idea, for example. So, I think there's a lot to be told in this story before we hit 2030.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, and I do want to open up the floor to questions. If you have a question in the room, just raise your hand, and one of our ambassadors will bring you a mic. But we're going to start off with a question from our virtual audience. Lisa, I believe you have one of those?
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 questions specifically about hydrogen-powered vehicles in terms of where they fit in. Should we be focused on creating a safe infrastructure for hydrogen vehicles? Also a question about wait times for e-vehicles. So 2.
Stephen?
Lots more if you want them.
Okay, well, at the risk of sounding like a hydrogen proponent, and that's one of the things that we do, but it's not the only thing we do. We just started production of hydrogen fuel cell components at our plant in Kentucky, and those are being designed for use in heavy-duty trucks. And bluntly, that's where we think hydrogen is going to sort of take off in North America. It's going to be along those corridor routes. But having done that, once you have the corridors in place, once you have the demand for hydrogen that's sufficient, then you can start to look at other applications, which would typically be in fleet as opposed to a consumer application. What's more interesting as we go forward is the growing consideration in both heavy-duty space and the light-duty space on hydrogen combustion. So once you've got green hydrogen, then you've got more choices in terms of how you, how you address that market. So, I guess my answer is wait and see on that one. But deliveries of the first long-distance trucks are going to start this year, and production and volume will start next year. And in the meantime, as I said, if you are anywhere that we are selling zero-emission vehicles, we typically have them in inventory at the moment. So, come on down.
All right, anyone in our in-house audience that would like to ask a question to one of our panelists? Well, then we can go to another question from our virtual audience then.
Yeah, there's a question about government taxes in gasoline and whether those should be allocated toward building the e-vehicle infrastructure. So it's a simple one.
This is a good question. I think what we're going to see, as I said earlier, we have a change in the methodology that utility companies are going to use to address the infrastructure needs that all DER, not just EVs, bring. I think we're still in the early stages of understanding how to model that, because some of those benefits from that technology accrue to the grid at large, which is to all customers. So the grid rightly should pay for those benefits, and some of the benefits accrue to the consumers or the end users. So the end users should pay for those benefits. So there's this split as these things spill over into the regulated world of utilities. That hasn't happened with other activities that utilities have been involved in. Those were generally kept separate as unregulated activities. But these things are going to spill over, and they're going to allow operational benefits. They're going to allow management of energy flows. They're going to allow, importantly, utilities to avoid investment in capital infrastructure that's not needed just to meet a higher peak. And so those are big potential savings. So we have to figure out how that's going to play into the regulatory world and what it means. Does that involve taxes? Probably not. I think we'll find a way to do it without taxes. How do you collect, if you're the government, how do you collect the same amount in terms of taxes from EVs? That's a question I really don't have an answer to, but I don't think they're going to be needed to help build the grid infrastructure.
Do you agree, Stephen?
So a significant portion of what you're paying in a liter of gasoline goes toward the road, for example. That's not coming from the electric side of the industry at this stage. And as the balance shifts toward electrified vehicles, then we're going to have to find a way to replace that portion of the revenue stream for governments. So, how do they do that? It's either finding a different way to apply it to the cost of energy if you want to keep the same model going, or it's potentially tolling on roads or doing some other things to be able to generate those revenues. The bottom line is I think the future looks different than the past, and we're all going to have to sort of walk through this.
Yeah, and the roads, Peter and I had this discussion earlier, the weight of electric vehicles actually creates 5 times more damage to the roads. So, their electric vehicle owners aren't necessarily paying their fair share of road work like ICE vehicles. So there's a lot to go through now, isn't there?
That's it.
Well, this is great. This is a fantastic discussion. I want to thank you to our audience and again to Stephen and to Dan. And now I'd like to welcome Jordan back to the stage for our next panel on consumer costs, vehicle affordability in a high rate market. Jordan?
Thanks, Petrina, Stephen and Dan. That was really interesting. Yeah, great look at the uptake of electric vehicles and some of the challenges that we have coming up. Next, we're going to look at mostly the cost of vehicles. So as Petrina said on our panel, I think the average cost is around $67,000. We'll dive more into that. With our guests. Unfortunately, John McNally from Scotiabank wasn't able to make it, but we do have Yolanda Biswa, president of Canadian Black Book, which provides vehicle value insights and data. Welcome, Yolanda. And Barish Akurak, vice president of marketing intelligence with AutoTrader, a classified sites for used and new cars. Welcome, Barish. Hello. All right, so a lot of this panel came out of conversations that I have with people all the time. When they find out I am the editor of the Drive section, oftentimes they start asking me about cars and what they might want to buy next. And about 30 seconds into that conversation, if they've started looking for new cars, they always say, cars are really expensive. So, Barris, I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
And some quick numbers here, because I know Auto Trader tracks a lot of this stuff. What is the average price of a new car these days?
Yeah, I get that question a lot as well. As soon as I tell someone that I work at Auto Trader, the first question is, can you get a discount for me? I'm like, nope. The second question is, what's going to happen to used car prices? So, used car. So we have almost 400,000 new and used cars on autotrader.ca. And we crunch the numbers pretty much on a daily basis to understand market dynamics. So I brought quite a bit of data with me. So to answer your question specifically, speaking of used cars, so this data is actually from yesterday, very fresh. No one knows about this. So its average price of a used car is $38,700, which is a 1.3% below last month's figures and 1.4% below last year's figures.
So, some good news if you're looking for
they've been
used
coming
car.
down. They've been coming down, and there's more availability. On the new side, the average listing price of a new car is around $67,000, which is a 0.3% lower than last month and 10.7% higher than last year's figures.
And what about an electric vehicle? A new electric vehicle?
Electric vehicles is a new one is almost $76,000, but the good news is that the prices are coming down more aggressively. We are seeing an almost 15% decline on a year-over-year basis, and the peak was in the summer of 2023, which was $91,000 at the time. So it's come down by quite a bit.
And what do people spend on average as far as a monthly cost for a new car?
Right. So car prices are up compared to pre-COVID levels, and interest rates, as everybody probably knows, they're up. So we are looking at, for used car, we are looking at $645 a month. This used to be around $450 pre-COVID, so around 35-40% increase. And for the new car, we are looking at $972 a month on 75-month terms. So I don't want to sound like an economist, but consumers are resilient, so they're finding ways to deal with this.
What do you see as being behind this increase? Like you mentioned, it's 35-40% since pre-COVID. So if someone buys a car every 5 years and they're in the market right now, they're going to be in for a bit of a shock.
Yeah, so there are different factors behind this. So one is the supply and demand mismatch, right? So going back to the beginning of COVID, we know that we do a lot of research to understand market dynamics. And one of the things that we found out through research was that consumers wanted to own private vehicles, right? So the demand is on the higher side. But if you look at the supply side of things, because of all the supply chain disruptions and microchip shortages and whatnot, we estimate that 1.5 million fewer new cars sold in the market. So less supply, more demand. What happens to the prices? Prices go up. So that's number one. Number two, we've talked about EVs, and EVs tend to be more expensive than ICE vehicles. So we did this analysis to understand the difference between ICE and EV in price differences, and we believe that it's around 15 to 20%. So that adds up. In the prior panel, the conversation about consumers opting for larger vehicles. Larger vehicles tend to be more expensive, and also population growth is another one. More people are coming, and once they settle in, obviously they need the cars. And lastly, inflation. So these are the high-level main drivers of what we see in the market.
Yolanda, I know Canadian Black Book tracks prices as well.
Yeah.
What are you seeing as being behind a lot of this increase?
Well, a lot of it has to do, as Barris says, supply and demand. And of course, the economy has a big impact on it. The interest rates is really why you're seeing car prices are the way it is. But as Barris mentioned at the beginning, we are seeing MSRP going down on a new car, and that's because the market is going down. But it's not going down, it's just normalizing to pre-pandemic. because during the pandemic, when you had a supply-demand issue, wholesale value was the highest that we've ever seen it. So right now, the overall market in Canada is normalizing slowly, whereas in the U.S., from Q4 to Q1, they saw a significant decline. In Canada, from December to January, we saw like a 6% decrease just on the wholesale market alone. So it is normalizing. It's going back to the way it was, which is a really good sign. But the unfortunate things, we need interest rate to go down because consumers are very concerned about their monthly payments, and as a result, that's ended up with longer loans and lease programs, right? So, which is not good, overall for the economy. So we need to get that interest rate break at some point this year. So yeah.
Yolanda, I want to stay with you and on
Sure.
interest rates for a second. With them being so high, are you seeing more consumers decide to pay cash for cars?
Yeah, so, we have a stat from out of the United States where they're seeing 20% of new cars are being bought out by cash. But based on our conversation, Canadian Black Book, with OEMs and manufacturers who have both mainstream brand and luxury, they're seeing more cash component for luxury brands. And that's because people who can afford to buy a luxury car have a little bit more disposable cash. So, so obviously that's happening, but we don't have a specific stat in Canada what that looks like. But definitely, we've heard feedback from their manufacturers that they're seeing that on luxury brands. Yeah.
And so if consumers have cash, it's obviously cost effective for them to pay with cash, as opposed to the high interest rates. But how does this affect dealers?
Well, it affects dealers because they get taken out of the financing, process with the consumer, and also for services, because a lot of what we do, with our dealership relationships is services, and that takes them out of the process. If you buy a car cash and once the warranty expires, you pretty much can go anywhere you want to, right? So you lose that loyalty. So that's obviously a concern. Yeah.
Barish, are you seeing more customers looking for more economical cars now, like sort of under 40,000?
Yeah, we do. So what we did was we did this analysis to understand the demand on vehicles that are below 40,000 and above 40,000. And cars that are listed below $40,000 tend to sell at a much faster rate compared to how fast they used to sell, and compared to cars that are above $40,000. So definitely there's a little bit of shift from luxury to, not luxury, but above 40 to under 40 for sure.
So I'll follow that with the question that you mentioned everybody likes to ask you. Like, what can consumers do to get a deal?
Well, so I'm a car enthusiast myself, and I do look at cars pretty much on a daily basis. And the beauty is that once the autotrader.ca is on the screen, no one knows that I'm actually looking for cars. They think that I'm working. So, so we do have a feature, transparency feature, where we tell the consumers where the relative price of the listing is. Good price, great price, and we do get a lot of positive feedback from consumers. They tend to use these tools more. They compare cars, they understand the market, they research more when they have the budget and the make and model in their mind, and that's exactly what I recommend. Do your research. Once you know what you want, do your research. Look at cars, and once you find the car, just pull the trigger, because as much as prices are high, then the market is still healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Yolanda, is one of the ways also extending the loan period? Because I remember, like, when I was a kid, I think like 4 or 5 years was usually pretty standard for a financing or
Oh yeah, now
a
we're
lease.
seeing
Now 84 months.
84
90.
months. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're seeing 84 months, which is really scary. Canadian Black Book, that's one of our requests that we get, is that we need to, forecast out to 84 months. And it is definitely a trend. We're seeing that even with some of the other companies that do market research in the automotive industry, talking about the trend has been 84 months. So, and it is really to make that monthly price affordable, right? And as Barra says, like, it's research. You have to research the car that you want, and once you research it, then you just have to negotiate that pricing, and that's really the hardest part for a consumer, as trying to negotiate with a car dealer, right? So, yeah.
I have been on some build and price because,
Yeah.
like you, I end up looking at cars a lot for my job. And I have found that the standard is 84 months.
Yeah.
And then you have to, and that's like the price that it comes at the bottom, and then you have to like change the term
Yeah.
to basically get a different price and see if the rate changes at all.
I think because like when you look at the build on price, manufacturers are trying not to scare consumers off. Because if you go to like a 48 months, which was a popular term, then you're seeing the $900 or $1,000 in some cases of build on price cars where it's $1,500 a month. It becomes scary, right? So as a consumer, you're going to be like, I'm not going in to go look at a car if it's $900 or $1,000 a month. So that's why they default to the 84 months to kind of make it a little bit more attractive. Yeah.
I want to shift to looking at electric cars because, as we mentioned on the earlier panel, it's about $10,000 more for the average electric car. But I want to start off with citing a Deloitte report that noted 84% of new vehicle intenders expect to pay less than $750 a month. 63% expect to pay less than $500 a month. So I wanted to see what this looks like for electric vehicles. So I did the build and price on like the basic Hyundai Kona, and I think it was over 84 months, and it was $750. And there's not much. If you're looking at a fully electric vehicle, there's not much in the market that's going to be less. Maybe a Chevrolet Bolt. And we do a lot of surveys, or I look at a lot of surveys, but we also do a survey every year. One of the top reasons why people say they're not buying an electric car is because of the price. So they end up back in a gas car. So Baris, I want to start with you. Like, where do you think prices have to come down to sort of meet consumers?
I think there needs to be a bit more parity, right? So as I mentioned, while I was answering your first question, there's still 15 to 20% difference. Hyundai Kona, for example, right, like ICE versus EV, 15 to 20% difference. So they need to come down for sure. So, and then the other thing is availability, right? So right now, again, in the panel before us, there's like, 50 different models in the market, and it's expected to go up to 145 by the end of this year, I believe. So more availability, supply is going to go up, and then hopefully when the price parity is going to equalize a bit more than it is now, we should see a bit of a uptick in demand.
So do you see it as like economies of scale, more vehicles, like the price is going to naturally come down?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's it's complicated, right? So, for example, so it's not only the availability, but also there's the impact of macro factors. So let me tell you a quick story. So back in beginning of March of 2022, when the Ukraine and Russia war had just started, gas prices went up from 1.4 per liter to over $2. And we came to work, and we saw this little blip in the number of inquiries that were sent to dealerships. And we looked at it. EV inquiries went up by 567%, and EV searches went up by 89%. So there's also the impact of what happens on the things that they can't control. So I think I'm not suggesting that there should be an increase in gas prices, but there are different things at play, and everything needs to be at the right time in order to be able to kick off even faster, I guess.
Yeah. Yolanda, what else do you see bringing prices down? Like, are we in for, like the previous panel was mentioning, like smaller cars, less range, that sort of thing?
There are some smaller cars with less range. I think it's, to add on to Barish's point, although you see searches for EVs went up, you didn't see conversion rate really increasing, and that's a big problem, right? Like we still have consumers. You have the early adopters of the Tesla model, but we still see consumers reluctant to purchase an EV. Canadian Black Book, we did a poll at the beginning of 2023, an Ipsos poll, and the number one reasons for consumers not purchasing an EV is, like you said, it's pricing and range anxiety. It's one of the things that and charging anxiety apparently is the new one, because it's like first it was range anxiety, but now it's charging anxiety because if they go into a mall and they see chargers, some of them are not working. So right off the bat they're like hesitant to purchase an EV. So I think that we have to do a lot of work around education, charging infrastructure, and pricing, of course. You just need to have affordable pricing. It needs to normalize. I think that our industry maybe anticipated that demand would have been higher, and that's why maybe the prices were higher. But there needs to be some type of normalization and re-looking at that in order to get people to convert to an EV. Yeah.
So if I may add to that, so what Yolanda said aligns with what we see in our research as well. But also, in addition to all of this, right, we've talked about gas prices, we talked about EV prices, we talked about the consumer challenges and whatnot. But also, we feel like there's a bit of a confusion in the market, right? Mm-hmm. So we talked about incentives, right? Incentives change. Some provinces provide incentives. Some provinces don't provide incentives. Mm-hmm. Some provinces provide incentives based on your income. Like, I do read this stuff. Like, I'm interested, this is my job, and I love this stuff, and sometimes I get confused, right? So if I'm confused, I can't imagine what a general public, how confused they would be. So it needs to be simplified, right? The federal mandate about percentage of cars sold EVs, I think there needs to be a bit more planning around how we get there instead of just like dropping a number and then I'll see you later type of thing. So as I mentioned, I think it's pretty complicated.
We ran a story, in the paper a few weeks ago and recently online. But there are studies out there that compare gas cars to EVs, and they find over the long term, so like 10 years driving 20,000 kilometers a year, the EV ends up costing less. Like I guess the classic is the Hyundai Kona versus the Kona Electric. So we interviewed actually I think it was a marketing professor at York who talked about the psychology behind sticker shock, and that you see the upfront cost of it, but our brains are not programmed to think about like the EV being cheaper over time. Right. It's only that it's going to cost more because the price is more now that you're going to have to pay. But I wanted to get back to government rebates. So when we look at the cost of EVs in the U.S., oftentimes, if you do the conversion, it would be more than the car costs in Canadian dollars. A lot of automakers, when they bring cars to Canada, their EVs end up magically being like $1 less than $60,000. Right. And I suspect that's because of what the government is doing. So Yolanda, I want to start with you on this one. To bring prices down of EVs, like, is it? I know how Stephen feels about this, but is the government going to have to take a bigger role or a less role, or where do you see this going?
You would think so. It's funny because I asked this question of my team before I came because we drive about 250 cars a year before we set a value of a car, and I asked them exactly this question. How do you see the government getting involved? And their response was probably not. That this is something that's probably going to have to lie on the manufacturer's shoulders and how to make cars more affordable. Really, we're going to look to the government to build out an infrastructure and build it out faster, right? That's what the manufacturers are looking at. That's what the consumers are looking at, and I think that's what we're expecting to see happen, that a faster EV infrastructure gets built out. But in terms of bringing car prices down, we don't see specifically for Ontario, which is the main region we're talking about right now. It's probably we don't see the government getting involved for a while. Yeah.
How big of a role do you think government's going to have to play going forward?
Yeah, so my answer to that is, I think going back to the point that you made earlier about consumer psychology, right? So speaking about our EV research, we asked consumers whether they expect to any government incentives, and 31% of them said that. 96% said that yes, we do expect to see government incentives, and 31% said that they expect to see $4,000 to $6,000 in incentives. So once you get used to it, it's difficult to, oh, no more anymore. See you later.
Yeah.
Like I don't think that would work. That'll work. But again. Yeah, like as we talked about, right? Different provinces, different rules, different incentive programs. I don't think the market is ready for no incentive shopping for consumers at this point. But down the line, when things get a little bit more better in terms of the overall sales, and perhaps that's the way to go. But I think it's too early to pull the plug on incentives at the moment.
I want to stay on incentives, but move to maybe a different kind of incentives. Yolanda, we saw, it seemed like in 2019, you could walk onto a dealer lot, there were lots of cars, and they were being sold at great incentives.
Yeah.
Like the car maker or the dealers were offering, I guess, below whatever MSRP or doing a lot of things to try to get you to buy the car.
Yeah.
The pandemic hit, we had the supply chain issues. Where are we with, I guess, bringing incentives back?
Yeah,
for
so,
consumers?
yeah, listen, that was a supply and demand issue we had, right? I'm one who sold my used SUV for a lot of money during the pandemic, and that's because I got an offer I couldn't refuse. But we are seeing incentives coming back with some manufacturers, and we, at Canadian Black Book, we believe that it will come back. We will see more and more incentives as some manufacturers, compete to take market share, right? Because, one of the things that bring consumers into a dealership is, an incentive. If you remember, manufacturers that had all those great programs, employee pricing and all that sorts of stuff. So I think that we're going to see more of that happening, specifically as we move forward into to this year, into next year. And we're already seeing it. We're already having conversations with OEMs who are in that process of planning that. So, yeah.
Does it change the way that they market vehicles?
It changes the way that they market and the way the dealer markets. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's we're going to compete on pricing. Like that's where we are right now. And based on everything you're seeing in the market, where car prices are higher than it has been, one of the things to attract consumers is to compete on pricing. So we see some crazy incentives out there. If you drive going to London, Ontario, you'll see some dealerships on the highway with some, $99 a week,
Yeah.
right? So, and you're wondering how is this happening, but it is happening, right? So, we see that getting, I don't want to say worse, but more extensive. Yeah.
So it sounds like supply chain issues are being resolved, and we are close to being back to.
Well, I think the
Where it
supply
was
chain is
before.
being resolved because consumers have slowed down their purchasing habit right now. Like we're not seeing consumers purchasing cars, which is a large ticketed item. That slowed down, and as a result, is why you have. I think the previous panel talked about a supply of cars and dealership lots right now, where we didn't see that about a year ago. So I think we have, the competition will be for the consumer to get into the dealership to purchase a car. I personally have a lease car that I'm holding on to that I'm probably either going to buy out or I'm going to wait until the end and return it because of the interest rate, right? So, and I don't think I'm different from many consumers who are looking at it the same way.
Is there anything you wanted to add there?
Yes, a couple of things. So number one, you asked about incentives. So again, I looked at the data, and what we saw was that we are seeing a little bit of a decline in interest rates provided by OEMs. So the highs, I'm talking about average numbers. The average was around 6.2% in around November, and now we're looking at 5.8%. So that came down a little bit, which is good news. The other thing is around market going back to normal levels. I think when you look at the inventory availability at the aggregate level, things are looking pretty good, but the devil is in the detail, as always. So when you look at inventory availability by, say, manufacturer of origin, we see that domestic brands, they've recovered quite well. compared to 2019 levels. Same goes for European brands, but the Asian brands are still behind. So if you're looking for an Asian brand, maybe deals might not be there, but if you're looking for a domestic vehicle, not naming names here, there might be more opportunities.
I did get a new car in October, and the interest rates were anywhere from like 2.5% to like 9.5%. It was a big range, and I think a lot of that was like the cars all ended up like the MSRP on the cars, the different cars were all the same, but the monthly payment ended up being a lot different because of it. So
Yeah.
all right, I wanted to have some time for audience questions. Thank you for waiting for the microphone.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I'm curious if you're starting to see a reluctance in the consumers for used vehicles when you compare electric to an ICE engine, in the fact that the electric will have some battery issues, whether diminished capacity, diminished range, or even a replacement in the near future.
Like, to be honest with you, it's one of the, as Yolanda mentioned, and based on our research, we do hear these concerns from consumers. But in terms of like identifying that particular concern and quantifying its impact on used sales, I don't think we are there yet. I don't know. Like, am I understanding your question correctly, or?
I can comment. So
Sure.
it's a little bit of a concern for sure, because I think that we probably all saw the recent news media story of the car in, I don't want to mention the brand, in Quebec, where it was like a really great trade-in price, and then when the dealer looked at it, there was problems with the battery, and then that turned out to be a $30,000 fix. So when you have those kind of news media that goes on social media, that tends to impact customers. But yeah, it's a concern. Like, one of the things that Canadian Black Book we're looking to do is how do we evaluate the battery, the health of a battery, and put a value to that. So that's one of the things that our parent company Black Book has started doing in the U.S. and we hope to bring to Canada at some point. But it is going to be one of the number one things as we move forward to evaluate EVs, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me? At AutoTrader, you must have access to tons of data, vehicle data and information. Do you publish anything on a regular basis?
Yes, so on a quarterly basis, we have our price index that we publish, and where we talked about inventory availability, prices, and we look at the data in different aspects. So I'd be happy to send it over to you after this panel.
I will say I look at the price index all the time for stories that we do to include stuff in
I appreciate
in
that.
our stories.
It is pretty popular. It makes us proud. Thank you.
I'm just going to jump quickly on the used EV question, but we've been seeing price cuts happening quite dramatically with certain OEMs like Tesla, like significant price cuts, followed by other competitive price cuts. Do you folks have any data on how that might be impacting the used EV market have we seen those price decreases happening already in the EV market for used vehicles?
Yeah, so because at Canadian Black Book, we set the wholesale values for price, and we track the wholesale market. So really, when Tesla cut their prices, some manufacturers had no choice, and they continue to dominate the pricing in the EV market. So we have forecasted. I can take your information and share that with you, where we forecast for the automotive industry, the used sale market, used wholesale market, and where that's going, and also for new as well, that we can share that with you. Yeah.
Just to add to that, we actually we did look at this exact same phenomena that you mentioned, and whatever happens on the new side of things is a direct correlation on the used market. So 30% decline on new Tesla prices, 30% decline on used Tesla prices, so 100% correlation.
Lisa, were there any? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. I wonder if you have some data on consumer behavior. So people who, during the pandemic, started working from home, they're not returning to the office full time, they don't need a car all the time, and they're shifting behavior to use micromobility, transit more, and to use ride-hailing services, that kind of thing. And they're just saying, you know what, I'm holding off on not buying a car. I'm wondering if you have something about per capita car ownership because of changes in trends and young people not wanting to have or even having parking for their vehicle and just changing their behaviors. Wonder if you can comment on people not lining up when they're 16 to get a license and trying to buy a car the next day. Like that doesn't seem to be as popular.
Yeah, well, so on one hand, those people who didn't go to the office during the pandemic or peak pandemic, yes, they probably didn't need a car. But on the other hand, there's more and more local travel and less interest in ride-sharing services and public transport. So it balances itself out. And also, it's funny that you asked that question. I don't have the per capita metric, but on the other hand, 84% of the Canadians who work in an office, they drive to work. Right, so that's a big percentage, and there are more and more mandates around going back to the office. We don't hear that much about that kind of like shift in consumer behavior, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to call it there. But thank you very much to Barish and Yolanda. That was a really interesting conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. All right.
Next up, we'll have a conversation about data collection and privacy and security in our vehicles. As the amount of technology and sensors in our vehicles increases, automakers and drivers need to be increasingly aware of how the data is collected and might be used. And we have two great speakers today to talk about it. First up, we have Fahed Hassanat, co-founder, COO, and head of engineering with Sensor Cortec. Welcome, Fahed.
Thank you.
And next up, I'd like to introduce Ruth Promislow, a partner with Bennett Jones LLP. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you.
All right, we're just going to start off pretty simple here. Fahed, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about what you and your company do.
So I'm the CEO and head of engineering at Sensor Cortec. We are a software company. We develop AI for perception sensors. So basically any sensor that helps a machine perceive its environment, get information, make decisions, we promise to develop a software that can give better results and produce better data.
And Ruth, you're a lawyer, so not like in the weeds on the technology side, but how do you come to this privacy and data?
My practice focuses on privacy and cybersecurity, and so at a high level, that involves giving clients advice on regulatory compliance with privacy and related legislation, data monetization opportunities and issues, and then on cybersecurity, working with clients on breach preparedness and breach response.
Thanks. All right, Fahed, I want to start with you for the real questions here. Just quickly, what kind of data do cars collect now?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So cars are becoming more and more a software product. And you probably have heard this term many times, a software-defined vehicle. So basically, it's a suite of sensors on wheels. You have the sensors they're measuring the temperature of the engine, the angle of the steering wheels, the rotation of the wheels, up to cameras that are inside the cabins and sensors inside the cabins, as well as sensors that are outside of the cabin. So potentially, a vehicle can be recording everything that is happening inside the engine, inside the cabin, or outside of the vehicle.
How many, like on one of the cars you work on, like is it like hundreds or thousands? How many sensors are we talking?
Oh, I wouldn't say, I mean, there is definitely redundancy, so we would try to eliminate, because I can give you an example. With a set of 10 sensors that are picking up at a nominal rate of 20 frames a second, we collect 10 gigabytes a minute. So that's a massive amount of information, and obviously the challenge is not only in collecting it, but it's also in transporting it outside of the vehicle so that you can make use of it. The vehicle itself does not have the compute power to process that much information. It has to be transported outside. So there are really certain instances where the vehicle would collect massive amounts of information, and that information will be transmitted outside to be used for analysis. But I would say between sensors that are equipped inside the vehicle to measure all the mechanical and electronic components, as well as the in-cabin and out-cabin, I would say within a 50 sensor, plus or minus.
Ruth, was there anything you wanted to add about what kind of data is being collected?
Well, to add to that, I mean, in terms of the collection of data, it's immense, potentially, because we're talking about our entire infotainment system, so all of our contacts, if it's Wi-Fi connected, our browsing history, our music choices, all of our calls, our location, our routes, all of our stops. It will probably make connections about places we frequent. If we always park outside of a Starbucks, probably makes a connection that we really like Starbucks. There's a lot of information that's being collected, including potential recording of voice commands and therefore discussions in the vehicle. So images within, images outside the vehicle. Now, when you think about collected information, that's really only part of it, because then there are advanced algorithms that can be used to derive new categories of information about a person. So there are inferences being made about a person as well.
I want to get to sort of the scarier, more futuristic end of this, but Fahad, I just want to start with, like, a lot of this technology is being designed to keep drivers safer, cyclists, pedestrians, all the road users safer. And a lot of that we spoke on the previous panel, a lot of it was about how car prices are going up, but some of that reason is because new cars are packed with all this technology. But can you just talk a bit about how like the sensors are being used to make roads safer?
Absolutely. So I can speak for the technology that we develop and the sensors that we use. We primarily use cameras, LiDARs, and radars. And we really focus on this trio because we believe the trio represent a complete solution, a perfect synthetic sensor. Cameras are really weak in deteriorating lighting conditions. LiDARs are weak in other conditions. And radar, they're a great sensor, but they are very low resolution. We believe the three would work together would work and provide a safer environment. So we promote the use of AI because AI can adapt to changes in the environment, can give you useful information. We promote the use of sensor fusion because with sensor fusion you are able to accommodate changing conditions that are not addressed by current technologies. We believe that there's a gap in the market, and to be able to address that, you need to have that collaboration and consuming the data from all the sensors at the same time, and looking at them with the same level of importance. There's also the aspect of collaborating with other vehicles. So no matter how many sensors you can equip a vehicle with, it will still be limited to what it can see or where it is positioned. But by getting information from, for example, smart intersections or other vehicles that are in other locations, you will be able to collaborate and cover a bigger area, a bigger field of view, and therefore you can make more informative decisions. And I always love to use the example of a smart intersection communicating with a smart vehicle. The smart vehicle is getting closer to the smart intersection, but there's a cyclist that is coming really streaming, and it's not within the view of the vehicle. The smart intersection can send a message to the vehicle saying, slow down, there is an anticipated pedestrian or a vulnerable road user that is coming on your road. So the car then can make a decision either to slow down, change lane, or react accordingly to make the environment safer for the users.
Bruce, did you want to add to that?
No, I think Fahad's covered that.
All right, now we'll move on to some of the, I guess, more Black Mirror parts of this conversation. A Mozilla Foundation report said, quote, modern cars are privacy nightmare. We found privacy policies that included permissions to collect recordings of your voice, photos, fingerprints, and information about facial features, driving habits, and social media accounts. What do you think it's important for drivers to know when it comes to all this data that's collected?
I think the most important thing is that this is not really anything terribly new. Our phones are already, we walk around with our phones with us every second of the day, and there's already a significant amount of information that we hand over and that is collected about us as we interact with every website or with various apps and platforms. So this mass collection and aggregation of data is not new. We're already accustomed to it, and in fact, we like it. We seek it out. We like when Spotify recommends a new musician that we didn't even know about because it understands our taste, or Netflix recommends a movie we really love and because it understands our taste. So we do like this. We do seek it out, and so I don't think calling it a privacy nightmare is fair, because it's, I think we're opting into this. We like the convenience of driving and saying, I'm going to this address, give me the best route. That's what we're seeking. So yes, there's a collection of information, as there is in every other aspect of our life.
So we did a story a few months ago when one of our reporters looked through a bunch of privacy statements, and they're pretty vague, but they're also a bit scary. It's sort of like we can collect all this stuff, but we don't actually know what car companies are collecting. Like, can you speak to what they might actually be collecting?
Well, it can range, and it can be. I think those privacy policies, they're prepared with a view to being comprehensive. So the idea is to say we may collect one or more of any of these things, and it can differ. But I think, one, I'd say if a consumer doesn't understand the policy, there's an opportunity to reach out to the privacy officer, because they have to identify who that is and give you contact information. So you can access that information. And if you want to know what information about you is being collected, you can also seek to collect that. So if you want that level of transparency, you can seek it. And you can also find in the privacy policy that there are ways to opt out of certain collections, because only information that is required to deliver the product or service you're seeking can be a requirement. So if it's not a requirement to enable you to use this connected car, then you can opt out. And maybe the functionality won't be what you want, but that is your prerogative.
Fahad, your company now collects a lot of data for testing.
Yes, we keep it safe.
What do you do with the data?
Yeah, we keep it safe. Well, so it's very important to understand that, and from the perspective of an AI company, AI is like a child. You can view it as a child, and you need to teach it how to, the various things that are in the environment. So in a driving car scenario, you need to collect the data about how the drive, what the car normally sees in its path. So it's very important to show that AI as much data as possible. But beyond showing that AI the data and teaching that AI the data, then the data is no longer useful, because the AI has already transformed that information into the changes in its structure in order to produce inference about what it sees in the environment. Technically, what we do with the data once we collect it, one of the steps that we like to address is if there are privacy concerns, the first pass we would do if there are camera information, because I want to step back and talk about the data specifically from cameras, radars, and LiDARs. So radars and LiDARs, they do not capture data that identify a person. So there's no personal infringement in LiDAR and radar data. In camera, there is. And that's one of the steps that we take to address that is basically to obfuscate the faces. We blur the faces before we distribute that data for training by the various components in the company.
Ruth, you mentioned in our meeting earlier that new legislation is coming. So what does this mean for automakers and for drivers?
So there's new federal privacy legislation that is expected to pass soon, and that's for it's private sector legislation. And on a principled basis, there's no change in terms of Canada's approach to privacy, but there will be some very specific obligations imposed on organizations that collect and use personal information. So there'll be enhanced compliance obligations to document precisely what you collect, how you use it, to whom you disclose it, the purposes for which you collect it, and the period of time for which you need to retain it. I'd say right now, I mean, there's less clarity about what has to be documented. And I think this documentation is helpful, and it goes to your point about, isn't it so vague about what organizations collect? This enhanced compliance obligation will force organizations to really sit down and understand clearly what it is they're collecting and how it's being used. Because often, there can be many moving parts and divisions within an organization, and they're not as coordinated as we might want them to be in terms of their information management practices. So, marketing is off using information for one thing, legal doesn't even appreciate it. So, that can happen. And I think this new legislation will force some greater coordination within each organization. There'll also be increased focus on what kind of consent is required for collection and use disclosure of personal information. The current draft is framed with express consent being the default. Now, what that means is yet to be determined, whether that will mean opt-in, like I have to check a box to say, yes, you can collect this, or whether express consent means we posted it on our site, and if you didn't opt out, then you are deemed to have given your express consent. We don't have clarity on that. And I do expect that in this industry, because of this whole discussion, that the Privacy Commissioner Office will give some detailed guidance, as they do for certain sectors. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that for the automotive industry, because these cars are sort of computers on wheels.
So if it does move to more of an opt-in, it seems like that would really change the selling process of a car and the education for drivers.
It would. I mean, I don't know if it would move to an opt-in. I think you can sort of separate. There are certain categories of information where you'd expect, they're being collected and used. I mean, when we say go home and I've programmed home as my address, well, then you should expect that this is one of the pieces of information that's being collected. But when you get to the categories of less expected collection or uses or disclosures, like I didn't know this was being shared with third parties in exchange for some value being given to this automotive company, that's where you might see greater transparency requirements about sort of being upfront about that information practice.
I want to touch on a point that Ruth made, and so thank you for this very excellent explanation. From the technology aspect, it's very important. There's a balance between privacy and the impact on the AI industry, for example. Canada has been, amongst the leader in developing AI algorithms for automotive. And one of the areas that we are paying attention to is basically collecting biometrics to enhance the safety of the passengers as well of the safety of everyone around. Now, if there are strict rules about how do you use the data, how do you collect the data, that will create an overhead that will slow down the advancement in this field, allowing other countries that have less strict rules to surpass and excel in the research and development field of that. So it's a really critical balance, and it has to be done with care.
I just want to spend a few minutes before we take audience questions talking about sort of the other flip side of privacy and security, which is cars getting hacked. Fahed, just generally speaking, how concerned should drivers be?
Well, if you want to be hacked, all you have to do is say, I have the best encryption in the world. And people will volunteer. There are people that are already waiting for that challenge. The vehicle being a software a software product, a software-defined vehicle, opens it up, extremely, significantly to being attacked and being exploited, and I mean there is also the race between car manufacturers to put new technologies in the market, and there is also the the skepticism of is this secure enough? Is this product secure enough? So we have to live with that. But it's a learning process. It's a learning curve. And I want to recount a couple of incidents. So as simple as the key fob. So in certain cars, you have to have the key within proximity of the vehicle so that it can open up. So certain people found ways to come in with antennas. You are in your home. Your key fob is far away from your vehicle. But they come up with antennas to boost the signal from your key fob in order to control your vehicle. So that's one vulnerability right there. It's glaring and hasn't been addressed. This is very recent. And one of the other aspects, and it's probably a bit more dangerous, AI, when it looks at an image, when we look at an image, we see a person, a chair, lights. And AI, specifically a deep neural network, breaks down that image into very small, very low encoded shapes that for us they do not make sense, but for a machine they make a lot of sense. So, for instance, there is somebody that printed a shirt that prevented vehicles that are equipped with AI and cameras from detecting that it's a person. And that's for fun. So imagine what it can be then, if this can be exploited into a bad way. So manufacturers that are implementing AI have to address that the AI has been trained in a way to detect patterns like these and make a distinction. So there is a learning curve. We're excited about the technology. We're putting it out there, but there is a lot to learn and a lot. A lot of expectations, but this is a new technology. Be ready for mistakes and faults, and I hope that manufacturers can address that as quickly as possible.
All right, we have a few minutes for audience questions. Is there, that gentleman right there.
Thanks. You touched on it a moment ago about the key fob. We're having a rash of thefts of vehicles. With some of the things we're talking about sound very futuristic. It doesn't appear that vehicles like Teslas are being stolen, which just seems like a very high-tech vehicle. They seem to be only the ICE vehicles. Can you explain to us why there would be a difference of stealing of one type of vehicle as opposed to another one?
Well, it's the same as how fast was this rolled out to the market. People scanning the signals and playing and knowing that, oh yeah, this is you're using this type of program, that you're using this type of signal. So this information is handily available. You can buy Raspberry Pis, you can buy things that can collect data, again, to collecting data, and expose certain weaknesses in certain manufacturers. I don't know if Teslas have layers of redundancy, and that helped them a lot in preventing thefts, and I don't think other manufacturers address that. But
Teslas also have a lot of cameras. So like if you park next to a Tesla and you get out of your car, you'll see like a little red light go on the screen. It's recording you. So if you...
I also think that if the vehicle's moved, at some point or other, they'll just turn it off, and it will be of no value without the connection to Tesla.
Yes.
So with regards to the data on the vehicle, there's ownership of the data and then liability that comes from it. So from an ownership side, there's been some contention as to who owns it and who can use it. So for instance, the OEMs can use it to better predict service standards and then get benefit over like Walmart or the various service centers. So there's that one side, but there's also the liability if a breach actually occurs. So, I mean, either way you can speak on it. Where does the liability end for Sensor Cortex in terms of we collect it, but if something happens on the vehicle, that's on the manufacturer who integrates ours, or if it's on the other side, if we own it, who should then be able to have access to benefit from it, commercially speaking?
Well, just the starting point for, first of all, the question, we could have a whole day on that question. Yeah. But the starting point, generally is that the entity that is collecting and determining what uses will be made of the information is accountable. And they may outsource certain aspects of their operations, but they remain accountable. And then they may, through contract or otherwise, impose some relevant obligations on those third parties.
On the tech side, so manufacturers, once they've received and implemented the algorithm inside the vehicle has to drive a certain number of kilometers in order to, for that sensor to be approved to be in production. And while this is not necessarily the level that it will expose the sensor to all points of failure, it will cover a very large number. So in terms of liability, if there are accidents that could happen, we expect that the manufacturer would implement levels of redundancy again to prevent. So if you have Six Sigma, and then with another Six Sigma in front of it, you are increasing, by many orders of magnitude the possibility of an accident happening. So there's a lot that can be prevented with a layer of redundancy. So imagine many.
Great panel, folks. Great conversation as well. It's on? Okay, perfect. It's a double-layered question. One is safety related. I don't think anyone spoke about safety and the benefits of safety. You touched upon LiDAR earlier, but the data sharing is also, because every manufacturer is looking to move towards a LiDAR technology, would then in tow have the vehicles communicating with each other to make them safer on the road. So in terms of regulation and legislation and that data sharing component, how does legislation need to evolve for there to be no legal friction, to put it lightly, when it pertains to that? And on the second point, you just spoke about the accidents, right? So it brings us to all the information being registered. And legislatively, again, the evolution of the way that we do function as a society, because insurance companies now could start lobbying for access to that information in terms of speed and whatever. So at fault, what does that really mean? So, information in terms of the impact. The car's registering so much information now that could potentially be beneficial to the legal system, detrimental to the driver, possibly, depending on who's at fault. What's the direction that we're anticipating things to go, if that's even an easy one to answer? And or what guidance do you have for drivers moving forward when it pertains to that?
That's a tough question. I think generally technology has been moving at a much faster pace than regulation. And we're seeing that, with AI just generally in every sector, where we don't even have AI legislation yet, but at the same moment, we're seeing AI being used in such a wide variety of ways and impacting human lives. So I don't think there's a clear direction in which it's going. I do think there's an appreciation in this country that our strategy has to align with that of other countries on AI and more generally how it impacts this sector. But I think there are several very tough, complex questions that regulators will try and work out, and it's never going to be perfect. There's no question there'll be disputes that ensue.
Yes, it's and it's an interesting question. But I mean, from a driver point of view, I think if it's good for the driver because if you're not at fault, there's nothing to worry about. You know, it'll only be to your benefit that there's no data collection is if you're at fault. You know, I think it's also knowing that you are going into an experimental, you know, or something that is not complete or something that you have to agree to, gives sort of leeway to deploy more technologies and allows for that flexibility to, you know, to handle accidents.
We are going to have to call it there, but thank you, Fahad. Thank you, Ruth, for a very interesting discussion today.
Thank you.
And I'm going to turn it over to Petrina for our last panel.
Thanks, Jordan. That was excellent. And now it's time for our final panel discussion, and it is Industry in Motion. How will Canada seize the moment, and how will the auto industry position itself for new opportunities? To tackle these questions and more, we're joined by our panelists, starting with Dr. Narayan Kaur. He's the director of the Center for Hybrid Automotive Research and Green Energy, or CHARGE, at the University of Windsor. Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
Next, we have Jessica Tate. She's the Sustainable Transportation Manager at Indigenous Clean Energy. And last but not least is Meena Bibra. She's the Senior Policy Advisor of Clean Transportation and Clean Energy Canada. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you.
I want to start off by just talking about the recent investments that we've seen in e-vehicle battery plants in Quebec and in Ontario, billions invested from VW, Stellantis, rumors of Honda setting up shop in Alliston as well. How much of a game changer are all these investments, not only to Canada, but to the auto industry, the economy? Meena, do you want to start us off?
I would love to talk about that. And I want to do a little bit of context setting. When we look at between 2000 to 2020, the automotive sector as a whole in Canada fell from the 5th largest automotive sector down to the 12th largest automotive sector. Automotive exports are Canada's second largest industry. And so the EV transition is actually not helping the automotive sector not only just survive, it's helping us thrive as well. I'm sure many of you in the room have heard Canada just ranked #1 in terms of its lithium-ion battery supply chain potential. We dethroned China for the first time, and that's a really big deal. Canada has attracted $37 billion worth of investments in EV and battery supply chains. We've punched above our weight when it comes to attracting large gigafactories and advanced manufacturing capacity like active cathode material manufacturing. When we look at the big picture, we have actually done analysis at Clean Energy Canada that shows that by 2030, the EV and battery supply chain in Canada can provide up to 250,000 jobs and up to $48 billion of economic activity back into this country. We just need to look at what's happening around the world. Governments here in Canada, across all political stripes, have put money on the table. They want our skin to be in the game. They want us to be competitive in what is an increasingly competitive EV and battery supply chain global landscape. And you just look down in the US, they are big proponents of free market, and they themselves have put tens of billions of dollars into bolstering their own EV and battery supply chain. You look at China, we all talk about China. They've been investing in this for the last 10 years, and they're a dominant player for that reason. But Canadian governments across the board have been putting in money so we can remain competitive.
Narayan, do you want to add to that?
Oh, no, I mean, Meena said it well. And automotive and automotive manufacturing is a big part of our GDP. And as the demand for EV grows, we see significant industrial, labor, environmental, and economic opportunities for the country. So now, as Meena mentioned, that we have a significant amount of minerals and metals that we can use to manufacture different components and build EVs. So the potential is there. We are #1. Last year, China was #1. This year, we are #1, which is excellent. So the potential is there, but how we seize that potential, ride on that potential, and really become number one. So that's the question, how we get there, right? And to get there, we have to see that do we have the right infrastructure. Companies from other countries can come and build factories, and our automotive industry, they're investing significantly, and that is supporting government investment. But unless we create the infrastructure that we need, that we one day be able to build those infrastructure ourselves, right? So number one, that. Number two, that in order to operate those infrastructure and be sustainable, we need, for example, operators, right? Who operates any plant? We can bring a high school graduate, we can train them. I come from academia, so I will be a little biased. I will swing the conversation towards academics when I can. So a high school graduate we can train, and they could operate plants. Then we need technicians. Our colleges can help in training technicians. Then comes engineers and experts, where we look at universities who, through comprehensive training, multi-year training, can create those, right? So as we see right now, that we don't have enough of a specific know-how and this talent pipeline, right? So as we invest in building infrastructure, there has to be some proportional investment in academia so that we can develop the talent pipeline and help industry become sustainable, right? So that we continue to be a leader. I mean, for example, I come from Windsor. Windsor is the automotive capital of Canada because of Detroit there. We are the sister city. We can manufacture every component of automobile, right? We put them together. We sell those automobiles. In the case of electric vehicles, we don't produce battery supply chain. Yes, we are developing. How about electric motor supply chain, power electronics supply chain, control supply chain, the software supply chain, right? So we don't have that, right? So we need to make sure that we have localized supply chain. EVs are built where the components are built, right? For traditional automobiles, you can build one part in, say, Ohio, and that would cross the Ambassador Bridge, come to Canada, will go back to Indiana, coming back to Windsor multiple times before it goes into an automobile. But in the case of EV, say we are building a battery pack, we are not sending the battery pack anywhere. The battery pack, all components should be built nearby. You build the battery pack. Similarly, powertrain components to be built nearby, and EV manufacturing facility has to be nearby, right? So we need to make sure that we have all the ingredients we need, but do we have that skill set? Do we have the infrastructure, right? So that as we can build all components in Windsor for traditional automobiles, can we build, or when we will be able to build all components of EVs in Windsor? And at that time, we can say that we will still be number one and continue to be number one.
I want to get to the skilled part of the workers a little bit later on, but I want to bring Jessica into the conversation and talk about these challenges in setting up EV charging stations in rural and remote Indigenous communities. I want to talk about some of those challenges and what you're doing with your Charge Up program to sort of level the playing field.
Sure. Is it okay if I speak a little bit to your first question as well?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So I do want to acknowledge I don't have the level of expertise as my panelists, my co-panelists here, but I do want to share that I've been thinking about this quite a bit since you've asked the question, and thinking quite a bit about the economic opportunities we're talking about, all the job creation we're talking about, the environmental positives that we're talking about. All of these things are really, really important. And I'd like to bring into the conversation equity and the considerations kind of as every different group is moving so quickly right now, and there's a lot of work to be done. But I do want to kind of consider where those jobs are, and I understand that many of them, you know, we have plants set up. They're located often much further south, and then the extractive resources happening often quite a bit farther north, which kind of gets to the question you asked. There are a lot of disparities in terms of access, and that includes, you know, to jobs, that includes to infrastructure, not just the EV infrastructure, but also existing infrastructure that many of us take for granted. So reliable power grids, you know, connected networks. These things that we do require for this transition and to be able to access the charging infrastructure. So I just want to kind of also consider in this room, and as this goes out to industry, governments, all of the different stakeholders in this transition, to also consider creative ways of including people in different regions of the nation. I work remotely right now, and a lot of people do have the opportunity to work remotely, and that really opens up the opportunity with a lot of different roles, because this transition is not just about a factory floor, right? And we're going to need a lot of jobs to support the infrastructure and networks in the places that they are, right? So having experts travel from south to north to go fix EV chargers is not going to be, you know, a good option either. But yes, the question was about Charge Up, and Charge Up is a program. So I work for Indigenous Clean Energy, and we are a delivery organization for ZEVIP, NRCan's Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And this program, we're specifically focusing on supporting Indigenous businesses and communities, friendship centers. One of the really nice things about it is that with the broader ZEVIP program, you kind of have to have much bigger projects, and not every community and not every business either needs that or wants it. So we have a much lower threshold for accessing the funding. Projects can be funded up to $100,000, well, $99,999, as many of you know. But it's really wonderful, because the reality is that Indigenous people across the nation are leading in this clean energy transition, and this is a program that makes this part of the piece of the puzzle more accessible for them.
Now, we talked about the billions that are coming in from subsidies from the federal and provincial governments. Narayan, does Canada need to bribe companies to come here?
Well, it's not bribing. I mean, it's all business, good business, right? So if you look at Canada, why companies are coming to Canada, right? Especially battery-specific companies. Because we have a power grid that is 80+%, where 80+% electricity comes from clean sources. So that's number one. Number two, that we have 100+ year of experience in automotive and automotive parts manufacturing area. Then we have outstanding track record of producing highly qualified personnel, we call. So those are the main reasons why companies would come here. And on top of that, that in order to produce batteries, the ingredients we need, lithium, nickel, graphite, etc. So we have them all, right? So we provide a complete solution to companies that could settle here. So for their own interest, for our own interest, I think that's why it's good business for both parties. That's why they come to Canada. And we should welcome them, because we are learning from them. They would learn from us as well.
So as we're moving to, you know, manufacture ZEVs and these batteries, what skills do we need? I mean, I'll ask you, for our labor, how do we upskill, how do we reskill, how do we retrain
Yeah.
even, you know, an aging demographic that is in manufacturing?
For sure. And I wanted to also tackle a little bit of what Narayan had spoken about in terms of how do we achieve that potential. And part of that is talking about the education and the workforce training. I kind of see this as three key things that Canada needs to do to really achieve our potential and, you know, become, reap the benefits of the economic environmental benefits. The first is we really need to be speeding up our major projects, the impact assessments for major projects. We need to streamline that effectively across jurisdictions. And the second is, to what Jessica was saying, we need to do this in consultation with Indigenous, remote, and rural communities. We need to be doing this early. We need to be doing this effectively. And this actually speeds up the major project approval in the larger run, in the longer term. So this is actually something we need to focus on. The second point is around the education and the workforce training. I'm sure lots of you in the news have seen, I think back in November, the LG Stellantis plant had brought in workers from South Korea. And it was all in the headline, we're hiring foreign workers in Canada, why aren't we hiring Canadians? And that kind of rhetoric really hurts us. And our automotive sector is highly skilled, it's highly trained, but there's certain skill sets, there's certain parts of battery technology and electrification that we're not specialists in. South Koreans are. They have developed this kind of battery technology, so it makes sense to bring them in to upskill and train our current workforce. And then we need to be talking to educational institutions. Federal and provincial governments need to ensure they understand where the gaps are. Is it with the electricians? Is it at the maintenance level? Is it in the actual plant itself? So ensuring we're upskilling our current workforce and ensuring that we're training the future workforce. And governments need to ensure that they're enabling educational institutions to do that. And the third piece of the puzzle really looks at we have attracted, $37 billion worth of investments into Canada, and that's been a lot of it is foreign direct investment. But we also need to ensure that we're bolstering and fostering homegrown talent, research and development and innovation. When you look at companies here in Canada, you look at out in Dalhousie, Tesla looks at them for an important research facility. We have University of Windsor as well for academic research. We have Li-Cycle for battery recycling. So we need to ensure that we're balancing the dollars that the governments are bringing in on the table for foreign direct investment, equally as important on research and development and innovation.
And Jessica, how do you train or encourage young Indigenous people to fill those shortages that we may have?
Well, I don't right now, but we are hoping to develop a program for building awareness. Right now, many of our programs, so not the program that I work on, but some of the many of the other ICE programs are working on capacity building. And there are a lot of opportunities also to network with our organization. We have 2 youth programs, which are really, really wonderful. So I know that the youth programs are working on their own. One is an internship program and one is a project-focused program. But I'm really impressed by a lot of the work that they're doing also to almost educate up. And so bringing in Indigenous worldviews, into a lot of different spaces that haven't been exposed to them before, and adding a lot of value. And this is something, again, I'm probably not doing it justice, but when we talk about meaningful consultation, partnership, equity, it is an extremely important part of this. And there are a lot of youth that are really passionate about taking on leadership roles and leading clean energy initiatives and having great opportunities and bringing those opportunities also back home and sharing their cultural wisdom, the teachings that they've received, and incorporating them into some broader spaces that can benefit from them greatly as well. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope that's okay.
On the training part, if I could may add a couple of statements that as a university, we train them at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level. At the undergraduate level, it is on the university, right? Because this falls under our undergraduate curriculum. So we, as a country, if we look, that we do not offer enough EV-specific programs, right? So if you look at that, okay, so you develop the curriculum, it has to be approved by the departmental council, then faculty of engineering, then university senate, while making sure that Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board approves our program. And that could take
years,
between 1 to 2 years,
Yeah.
2 years or years, right? And then we have the first student being admitted. 4 years from there, we'll have the first graduate. So even if we started last year, I was talking about this to another event last week, that 5 years from today we will have the first graduate, right? So we need specialists, as Mina mentioned, but that specialist would not be coming out until 5 years from today. But the battery plant is already there, and they're about to produce their first battery cell early next year, right? And those companies are producing battery cells 10 years ago. So they're way ahead in the game, and innovation is, when it happens, it goes up exponentially. If I am behind, it is not easy to catch, right, our competitors. So that's why the time is now. Unless we act now, it would be difficult. So at the undergraduate level, and we need government support, because if you would like to offer EV-specific programs, then you need building infrastructure, lab infrastructure, technician support, professors to teach curriculums. So, and that's a lot of money. And university is already constrained with funding.
Is Canada falling behind when you look globally, Mina? Or?
Yes, I mean, if you see, I mean, I would not name, I was at an overseas battery plant that was built 9 years ago, right? And that is twice bigger than what we have going to have in Windsor. So, and that means they're that ahead of time. So to be at their level, it will take some time, but we need to be aggressive. But we have the innovation capacity. We work significantly with industry. And universities are innovation powerhouse, right? So through effective university-industry collaboration, we do a lot of innovation, right? That goes into the products that company optimize and commercialize. So we do great innovation, but in the EV sector, we have not done enough. And that's why the investment is so urgent, right? That to facilitate that innovation, to facilitate that creation of these highly qualified people who can make sure this industry we are creating become sustainable. So that's a meaningful collaboration, government's support to make sure that those collaborations can produce results. Those collaborations can train students. So that's why government support is very important.
And just to answer your question about if we're falling behind, I don't think we are falling behind. I think the money that's been put on the table by governments shows our intention that we want to put our skin in the game, and we want to be competitive. And so now, from our analysis that we had done, we had a moonshot scenario where we said, we're going to get 3 gigafactories by 2030. We got 3 gigafactories. We landed those 3 deals in like the last, 2-3 years. So that's extremely impressive. That happened really quickly. And so because our automotive workforce today, it is highly trained. There's certain skill sets. It's not the largest percentage of the work when it comes to the battery supply chain, but there's certain skill sets that we do need to bring in from abroad for the short term. And because we landed those deals so quickly, I think we just need to look at it in the perspective of while we upskill and provide that training to our local population, it's just going to take a little bit of time to be able to get that domestic capacity here. But we do have great innovations happening in Canada. We have homegrown companies that have started here, ranging from automotive companies like Lion Electric, on the EV side, have Dalhousie University does research with Tesla. We have Li-Cycle doing battery recycling. We have all these companies that are starting here, and they have that homegrown talent here. So I wouldn't say we're falling behind. I think we're just putting the work in now to make sure that we're staying competitive.
So from the mining of batteries to the building of batteries to the recycling of batteries, are we more in charge or getting that EV supply chain all in order now? Do we have every aspect of it?
Well, I mean, on the battery side, I think in the short term and in the long term we'll be okay. But we also need to look into other components that make an EV battery plus those components like electric motors, power electronics control, etc., etc. So we need to make sure that we also develop those supply chains. And on the, I mean, you mentioned recycling, so I will bring the sustainability into the equation, that as we grow this EV ecosystem, we need to make sure that this ecosystem is sustainable, right? And sustainability in this context could include many things. Among them could be, say, number one is economic sustainability, right? EVs have to be cheaper. I mean, EVs are very simple. If you look at, there are not many moving parts. They are supposed to be cheaper, but they are not cheaper because it comes down to, as our previous panel was highlighting, that we are not, I mean, the sales is not high enough, right? And as a result, we are not building enough components. I was at a battery tray factory. So they have this huge battery tray manufacturing facility, but they're building that battery tray for a particular model and not enough units. So as a result, this automated battery tray manufacturing facility is very costly. So per unit cost of those battery tray is very high. So tier one supplier would pass that cost onto the OEM. OEM will pass that cost to the consumer. So unless we consume more and more, we don't build enough unit. As a result, the cost will not go down, right? So just like any new technology, so as we consume more and more, it will become cost effective. So that cost, economic sustainability. Number two would be that national security, right? There are many components like rare earth magnets in electric machines we use. They are not environmental friendly. Plus, they come from overseas. Can we find other ways, use national, local sources to replace magnets, rare earth-based magnets? We use a lot of copper. So instead of copper, can we use something else? In that way, I mean, economic sustainability to environmental sustainability to making sure that we develop a secured supply chain. Plus, we make metal material from mining to processing to component development to EV manufacturing, the whole process sustainable, right? So as we grow, we need to keep that sustainability issue into mind as well.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about what Narayan's point was around the sales aren't happening. I would be remiss if I didn't speak about this. In Q3 last year, Canada hit 13% sales. You look at BC and Quebec, 26%, 22%. Some parts of Quebec hit 40% EV sales. We are, the sales are increasing, and they're increasing exponentially. And I think when we talk about auto manufacturers, we sort of look at the pure play manufacturers differently than legacy manufacturers. So we look at people, companies like a Tesla. They're probably one of the few OEMs right now that are actually, if not the only OEM right now, that's making a profit on their vehicles. And the reason they're doing that is because they're producing at scale. They've developed a manufacturing process where it's kind of like building on like a set of matchboxes. You just build a layer on top of a layer. And so they've really figured out a manufacturing approach over the last 10, 15 years to produce at scale and produce profit. Now we're seeing other legacy manufacturers trying to figure out a way of how are they going to do this cost effectively. There's clearly a demand in the market. People want electric vehicles. And Canadians want Canadian made and affordable electric vehicles as well. So Ford recently, for example, just announced that they're going to be pivoting their automotive strategy for electric vehicles. They said, they cut production on their F-150s, their electric their Lightnings, and they said that they're going to start focusing on smaller vehicles, and that's because they're more affordable. They can, try to make more margin on that vehicle if it's an electric vehicle. So we're seeing Tesla making significant price cuts as well. And so when we kind of look at where auto manufacturers need to go, there's a little bit of a dichotomy when we look at some of those pure play battery manufacturers, auto manufacturers, versus where the legacy kind of original, they make a mixture of gasoline versus battery electric vehicles as well.
I want to go back to sort of the environmental concerns and bring Jessica in the conversation to talk about, when we're mining critical minerals, talk about some of the challenges there, the environmental impacts, the concerns with land rights when it comes to Indigenous communities.
Sure, it's a big topic, and it's an important one to consider, especially when we're thinking about de-risking. When we're talking about having investment, having Indigenous participation and buy-in and equitable partnerships is incredibly important. And the reality is that we have a history of extractive processes and practices that have been incredibly detrimental and a lot of lost trust. And so this is something that I say is in the past. For many groups, it continues today. And so there's this kind of balance. And a lot of the folks that I speak to are really interested in zero-emission vehicles. And there's a really deep desire to have everything roll out in a good way. And to have that, and that means, really considering culturally and spiritually important lands, considering water and safety, considering wealth and equity in the economic opportunities, considering sovereignty, and these aren't easy conversations. These aren't easy things to navigate. We have a pretty entrenched history that if it was easy, it would be fixed already. But we are seeing, not just changes in government, but changes in industry as well. And I think that's a really, really important consideration. I'm not an expert on this, but I have heard Indigenous leaderships that have a call to action to not just go to government about whether you can, explore for minerals or not, but are you coming to nations? Do you acknowledge nations' sovereignty? Do you acknowledge that that's their land because it is their land? And so that's a step even that step is often missed. And building relationship is so important, and building relationship is important, not just to get your own way, right? But it adds a lot of value. The perspectives of the people who have been taking care of that land and love that land and want it to be healthy means that you're putting those environmental pieces and social pieces at the forefront. One thing that is of concern to me personally, and I think to many others as well, is that we expand our conversation to be considering social factors as well. So when you think about some development projects, are you having transient workers? Are they all men? What are the implications for women in communities adjacent to these projects? I won't get into that now, but I'd ask anybody listening to this to do some research if you're not aware, and also to be considering the municipalities who need to be taking care of the transient workforce as well, and also the benefit of having the local workforce participating. And that might require investment in growing skills, but what's wrong with that? I don't see anything wrong with that. That's a critical and important part of this conversation, and it's going to be something that will get industry a step closer to what their ultimate goals are, and is equitable and important.
Well, that's a nice way. I know we could go on a lot longer, but we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to open up the questions to the floor, and we have one here from Peter.
Thank you very much. It's really more of a comment than a question. I want to just contribute that everything we're talking about here is really a 40 or 50 year investment, a transformational change in everything. I think there's been a temptation over the last few years for people to say, oh yeah, there's the government just blowing more money, bringing in some foreign company. That's not what this is at all. This is a whole sea change in how the country functions, how we move around, how we talk to each other, and everything. And I think it has to be looked at very much more in that light. It's a 40 or 50 year program, 100-year program. It's not a 5-year program until the next big thing comes along. This is the next big thing. It is here. And in my view as a Canadian, if we didn't make this transformation now and take part in it, as Narayan and the other panelists have said, we would miss that opportunity, and we would wind up just digging up our rocks and selling them to other people. And that won't do anything for the northern communities, it won't do anything for the south of Canada, and it will just continue to leave Canada as, you know, the proverbial hewer of wood and drawer of water. And we can be so much more.
If I could react to that just really quickly, I think you're bang on in terms of your comment. What Canada does in the grand scheme of things, you know, I think the electric transition, if electric vehicle transition is going to happen, regardless of if Canada is on board or not. That's really the cards on the table. That's what's going to happen. So at the end of the day are we willing to put the investment up to ensure that we're reaping those economic and environmental benefits? We don't want to be just selling our critical minerals out, you know, to the U.S. and not really getting any added value from any of the resources that are being sourced from our own country. So Canada needs to ensure that we are a supplier of choice when it comes to sourcing critical minerals and upgrading and processing those minerals as well. So it's really is whether Canada wants to be involved in this or not in this competitive landscape.
Well, that is a great way to end it. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I do want to take the time to thank our sponsor, Toyota Canada and the University of Windsor, for sponsoring today's event. And I'd also like to thank all of our panelists here on our stage today and who came with us all this afternoon. And again, I want to thank our audience for joining us in person and virtually and for those great questions we've had. I do want to remind you, you will get a link to this recorded webcast in about 2 weeks' time. So thanks again for joining us today. And for our in-house audience, we have a networking session next door. So please join us for that. Thank you again.